Hi, everybody. We're going to talk today about the situation after the dictatorship of Sulla. And there's a lot of material to get through here, so I'm going to try to not waste any time, get off on any tangents or anything like that. Here we're in the final stretch of the Republic, and we've discussed some of the factors in the downfall of the Republic up to this point, and I just want to reiterate some of these, specifically with reference to what's happening between the early 70s BCE and the late 30s BCE when the whole thing goes down. First of all, there are these political factions. We talked about the Popolades and the Optimates. I don't want to put too fine a point on that because these are not really political parties. There are factions. And one of the things to point out in reading, especially the Watts book, is to note that individual politicians tend to shift their opinions fairly rapidly, the rule really more is opportunism and ambition than adherence to any kind of party line, but there are certain political precedents that get set that have a lot of imitators. And so the dictatorship of Sulla, for instance, really freaked a lot of people out. And they were worried that Rome was just going to devolve into a constant round of ambitious men jockeying for position, gaining a client army, defeating their rivals either politically or militarily or both, and then establishing a dictatorship and, undergoing proscriptions, killing political rivals like Sulla had done, and that this was just going to be the way of things. And there were some who seemed to have been fairly comfortable with that and even made moves in that direction. But on the other hand, a lot of politicians were upset about this, and even those who had supported Sulla for the sake of either staying alive or profiting off of that or whatever, they weren't willing to go as far as he did. And so, there are political factions here, but it's not so cut and dry as to say that there are just two political parties and everyone is adhering to one or the other. It's not quite like that at all. There's also a lot of corruption here, and this is just the norm, and it had been, frankly, through much of the Republic, that senators and equestrians and those who held power saw corruption just as the way of things. This is how one enriched oneself. It was remarked by, I forget which Roman author, that if one was appointed as a proconsul or propraetor to govern over some conquered territory, that it took you needed to be in that position for at least 3 years. The first year was spent amassing a personal fortune. The second year was spent amassing enough money to buy a legal team that would protect one from prosecution for skimming money and extorting and all of the unsavory things that these noble Roman governors tended to do. And then the third year would be spent accumulating enough money to bribe the courts so that when they were prosecuted for this, they could get off without being penalized. And that's a bit of a cynical view, but it just goes to show how aware people were of corruption, how normal this was, even perhaps how accepted it was, and yet at the same time there were those who were best at this tended to amass amounts of wealth and power that were totally unrivaled, and this exacerbated the whole problem of the wealth gap and things like that we've already talked about as factors. Politicians, and by that we mean mostly people of senatorial rank, they tended to cater to two main groups politically. One of these was the Equites, or the equestrians, and the kinds of issues that the equestrians worried about most were things like tax contracts, because people of patrician rank or senatorial rank were not supposed to participate in business, as we've already talked about. Truthfully, many of them did. Even those who were the most committed to the old order of things, tended to do this in secret. We'll talk in due course here about Marcus Porcius Cato the Younger, who was this voice for the old order of and the old way of doing things, and was just this intransigent political opponent of Pompey and Crassus and Caesar and others who came to the fore of politics in this period. He claimed to be this old style. I mean, he's really operating in the guise of his great grandfather, Cato the Elder, who we talked about earlier. But Cato the Younger, like the Elder for that matter, was involved in all sorts of shady dealings, despite condemning them publicly. And so, the Equites would have been interested in tax contracts and anything that had to do with business throughout the Mediterranean. The Equites were the primary movers and shakers in these fields. And so, better terms for tax collection, better terms for trade, things like that. And politicians were willing to cater to them because the Equites had the most movable wealth of any entity in Rome at this time, including the senators, because the senators were supposed to have wealth in the form of land, and many of them did. The other main group is the urban poor, and there were politicians who were extremely skilled at catering to the urban poor. The most skilled, I think, was probably Julius Caesar. But Lucius Sergius Catilina, who we'll talk about in this lecture, he also made an attempt to appeal to the urban poor by having their debts abolished and things like that. Of course, that would have helped him too because he was deeply in debt. But politicians could appeal to the Equites and get kickbacks from them and political support from them. They could appeal to the urban poor and get support from them, and that support came largely in either mob violence or the suppression of mob violence. The urban poor tended to riot in support or protest, support of a politician, protest of a politician, and the corresponding politicians could put a stop to this sort of disorder by calming the urban poor, but they often held the political process hostage to do that. Caesar certainly does this, as does Marcus Antonius, as we'll talk about later. So what happens to the Republican ideals in this period? Well, in a way, the Republican ideals are part of the problem here, okay? That politicians, and Cato Cato the Younger is almost certainly the most guilty of this, but Cicero does this at times. Even Pompey participates in this. At using the ideals of the old Republican order, a la Sulla, to stop change from happening, to prevent their opponents from achieving their political ends. And this just makes the opponents that much more determined to accomplish what they want to accomplish, even if it means doing it in an illegal or underhanded way, right? Cato is perhaps more responsible than any other individual, even though he holds far less power than either Pompey or Crassus or Caesar, or, he holds a similar amount of power to, say, Cicero. But Cato is, in many ways, the most responsible for the downfall of the Republic because he tried to oppose everybody. And he did this in a rather hypocritical fashion often, because he was guilty of many of the same things that he was accusing his rivals of. And so, people became cynical. Seeing a champion of traditional values like Cato do hypocritical things just made people not take this seriously, and they gave their loyalty to whichever leader happened to cater to their interests, and we no longer have a commitment to the Republican ideals among most of the population in Rome by this point. And as I've said already, personal ambition. I mean, this is suspect number one in the murder, metaphorically speaking, of the Republic, right? There was nothing in the Republican system that allowed for the kind of personal ambition that we see from figures like Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, even Cicero and Cato, right? It just didn't work. There was not enough of a check on that, especially as the rules are bent, as new institutions are created in an ad hoc fashion, and the Republic just collapsed under its own weight, and the weight of corruption, the weight of personal ambition, and all of that. Okay, so hopefully, we have a sense of where things are going here. After Sulla's retirement and then his death shortly thereafter, Sulla died in the year 78, there was almost an immediate reaction. There were a few people in the Senate and among the Equites, particularly those who had been made senators by Sulla, who tried to perpetuate the changes he had made, but everyone recognized that these things were so blood-soaked that it was going to take a lot to, or rather, that there was no sense in trying to keep them in place. And so his laws are almost immediately undermined, and this is especially so with the powers granted to the Concilium Plebis and the Tribune, that within 3 years, Sulla's dictate that the tribune anyone who held the office of tribune was not able to seek other political office. That was done away with by the end of the 70s, specifically during the consulships of Crassus and Pompey. All of the other checks the limitations on the tribune were done away with, and we're back to the status quo with the tribune, where this is the most active political office. And so, that's just one example. There were lots of others where people just ignored and pretended that the decrees of Sulla had never happened, or legally undermined them or did away with them by using one or another organs of the Roman government. Also, in the aftermath of Sulla's death, certain of his, and I've put the word henchmen on here, that sounds rather menacing. Maybe we should have just said supporters. Those who had been most effective, how about this, in taking advantage of the unique situation that Sulla presented. In the proscriptions, meaning the executions and seizures of property of the rivals of Sulla, certain individuals had done very well for themselves. The most successful by far of all of Sulla's supporters was Marcus Licinius Crassus. This is his bust here on this one right here on the right side. The other one is Gnaeus Pompeius, Sulla gave him the epithet of Magnus, or the Great, so we'll call him Pompey Magnus, or Pompey the Great from this point on. That was done somewhat cynically, but Pompey seems to have taken it seriously and definitely backed that up and came to deserve that epithet. But let's talk about Crassus for a moment here. Okay, Crassus, while he had participated militarily to some extent in the proscriptions and in the military maneuvers of Sulla, it was during the aftermath of that, when Sulla was in command of Rome and snatching up territory from the people he executed, that Crassus was extremely active in the real estate market. He came to possess just huge amounts of territory. Some of it he sold, some of it he invested in certain ways. He came into possession of huge numbers of slaves. One of the things that Crassus is purported to have done is to have started a kind of fire brigade. Rome didn't have anything like that at the time, and buildings were made of wood and roofed with thatch or straw, and so these are all fire hazards. When a building caught on fire, Crassus would bring in his fire brigade and then talk rapidly to the owner of the house, saying, well, will you sell me the house if I loan you the fire brigade? At least you'll get something for it, otherwise it's going to be destroyed. And they would often sell it at a highly reduced rate. And then Crassus would order his fire brigade to save as much of the house as they could. And this way he came into possession of even more real estate. By the mid-70s, Crassus was easily the richest man in Rome. I mean, we're talking a plutocrat, the likes of which has rarely been seen in world history. You know, he would be the modern day Jeff Bezos or Warren Buffett or something like that. Okay, so Crassus was extremely wealthy. The other main supporter of Sulla who came to the fore was Gnaeus Pompeius, who is seen on the left-hand side here. That's his bust. He didn't do. He benefited from the proscriptions like many of Sulla's supporters did, but he was extremely active militarily. He was sent, for instance, he was in the army of Sulla, and after that he was sent to put down some rebellions that were breaking out in Spain. Actually, this rebellion had sort of several lives. There was a rebellion in Spain during the time of Sulla, during the dictatorship of Sulla. Right after Sulla's death, the consul in the year 78, whose name was Aemilius Lepidus, he had been a supporter of Sulla, but then he banked on, once Sulla was dead, he took the bet that the route of the Popolades was going to be more successful, and so he went to quell a rebellion in Etruria, and he decided to side with the people of Etruria in their protests, and thinking that he could assemble a client army by doing that. When he was defeated, Lepidus ended up in Spain, and sort of one thing led to another. And later on, there was a guy named Sertorius in Spain who set himself up as the leader there. And so Pompey was the main commander leading Roman troops against the Spanish rebellion, and he was successful in this regard. This just added to the laurels that he had already received. I mean, he was still a young man, only in his early 30s at this point. But even during the time of Sulla, he had convinced Sulla, due to some of his accomplishments, to grant him a triumph at age 23 or 24, which was completely unheard of. He was not an elected official, not a consul, not a praetor. That was triumphs were supposed to be reserved for those individuals. But Pompey managed to convince Sulla. This is why Sulla ended up calling him Magnus. Okay, and so Pompey was gaining a reputation as the most able military commander in Rome for good reason. And this was going to pay dividends for him in the coming years into the 60s BCE. So we'll talk about that in a moment here. The other thing that we witness in the mid-70s is the return of a lot of exiled Popolades who had been forced out of Rome, forced into exile, even many of their family members killed during the proscriptions of Sulla. The most prominent of these was a very young man at this point named Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was, during the dictatorship of Sulla, was only a teenager. He was about 18 years old when Sulla took power, and he had married the daughter of Cinna, who of course had been one of Sulla's main opponents. Her name was Cornelia. Not sure why. I think his name was Cornelius Cinna. Anyway, her name was Cornelia, and when Sulla took over as dictator, he commanded Caesar to divorce his wife. He actually did this a number of times. With many of his supporters, he would tell them to divorce their wives, and he was going to give them a better bride. And many of them did this in order to advance politically, since marriages were most often not for love, but for some kind of social advancement. But Caesar refused to do this, and even after Cornelia's dowry was seized by Sulla, Caesar, continued to hold to that line, and he had to go into exile for several years. When he returned in the early 70s after Sulla's death, he quickly established himself as a kind of new voice, and demonstrated his political prowess. I'm not going to go into any details there. You'll find some of these in the Watts book and even in the Thomas Africa textbook, right? So we'll have plenty to say about Caesar. Trust me on that. Now, one thing I didn't mention about Crassus, in the late 70s, there was a massive slave revolt led by a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus. One of my favorite historical films, maybe my very favorite film about history of all time, is the film Spartacus, directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring Kirk Douglas and Laurence Olivier. Douglas plays Spartacus, and Olivier plays Crassus. Well, Crassus was given the command eventually of 6 legions to put this slave revolt down, and after some initial setbacks by other Roman commanders, Crassus employed overwhelming force to track down and defeat the army of Spartacus, and he ended up crucifying about 6,000 of these slaves on the Appian Way for miles and miles outside the city of Rome. These crucified victims were, dying probably in the throes of agony. Not sure why Crassus thought this was necessary, but I guess he was trying to demonstrate that, a slave revolt was unacceptable. So Crassus gained notoriety for that, and this was the last major slave revolt in Roman history. There's never anything quite like this. The Kubrick's version, the film version, is overly romanticized. There's no question. It was made shortly after the period of McCarthyism, Joseph McCarthy, and the blacklisting of many individuals in Hollywood, and it definitely plays to that issue. But it's a very good historical film nevertheless. I think they did a great job trying to make sense of Rome. So highly recommended. Anyway. Pompey and Crassus hated each other. I think that's pretty easy to say. They recognized in each other their greatest impediment to success. However, during their joint consulship, they both won the consulship in 70 BCE, and they set aside their differences. In fact, they nearly came to blows at one point. Much of Rome feared that we were headed for another civil war, that this is going to be a repeat of Marius and Sulla, or Cinna and Sulla. But there was a dramatic moment where some of the Roman senators were begging both of them to make peace with each other, and apparently Crassus got up from his seat in the Senate and walked over to Pompey and offered his hand, and the two of them, agreed to work together for the well-being. And, we have to give, I think, both of them, but especially Pompey, credit. I mean, Pompey, several times in this sequence of events, Pompey could have taken much greater power than he did, and he was unwilling to do that. And, he refused to become another Sulla. I think that was all to the good. However, it ultimately meant that he lost in the long run. He did have a great deal of success in the meantime. They decided, despite having been supporters of Sulla, to appeal to the camp of the Popolades. They did this in a number of respects. The most important of these was through the full restoration of the powers of the tribune. They also catered to the Equites, and that was very popular, of course, among the plebeians, the urban poor, and others. They also catered to the Equites in settling a long dispute over the composition of law courts. Sulla had made it so that the Equites could not sit on law courts. These had to be entirely senators, or at least a majority of senators, I believe. And Caesar or rather Pompey and Crassus, push some things with support of tribunes, push some things through the Concilium Plebis with the support of the Senate that meant that the Equites had access to this. And this is actually one of the ways that the Equites tried to exert political power, was through serving on juries and participating in these law courts. A couple of other individuals who we might mention in this, who are going to play a role. So let me talk about them. As Pompey and Crassus are reaching the heights of Roman power under the Republican system, there was a young man who was he originally was he was an equestrian. He actually came from a city outside of Rome called Apulia, Arpinum. I was looking at my notes. I don't know. Anyway, I had Apulia on my mind. But he came from Arpinum, Cicero did not have a family background that would have ensured political success. He was not, from a senatorial family. He was among the Equites, but he wasn't even particularly distinguished among them. However, Cicero used his gifts to reach heights of political power that would have been unthinkable for almost anyone outside of somebody like Marius, who was from a similar kind of background, who used his military exploits to do this. Cicero was not a soldier. This is his bust, by the way, if you were wondering. He was probably the most effective orator. At least he is, he believed he was, and he describes himself that way. But he used his oratorical skills to achieve great success in the Roman political system. Using oratory, he pursued a successful law career, and I make it sound like he's a lawyer, like he's running a law firm or something like that. It's not exactly how it worked. Young men would often try to make a name for themselves by serving as prosecutors in law courts. Now, the prosecution was the less honorable side of a law court, especially if it involved some kind of noble plaintiff. But if these nobles were guilty of corruption or extortion or something like that, as many of them were, especially those who served as provincial governors, they could be prosecuted for this. And the prosecution was often left up to young, ambitious men who would prepare these speeches, and they could kind of ride the support that they gained from speaking well, even if they lost the cases. Cicero didn't lose his cases. Even as a young man, he was extremely successful prosecuting certain people. There was a guy named Verres who had been a supporter of Sulla, who was a governor in Sicily and had abused Roman citizens there. He had extorted money from the population. He was the worst kind of provincial governor. Cicero ended up as the prosecutor in his case after he was removed from power, or rather after his term as governor was up. It was common, actually. Let me mention this, and you probably have gotten some of this from the reading, that those who served in high positions in the Roman government, while they held those positions, they could not be prosecuted. But they could expect, especially if they got up to shady dealings, as many of them did, to be prosecuted in the aftermath, which is why, back to the quote that I gave earlier, or rather the paraphrase, that one had to, first of all, amass a personal fortune as a governor, and then one had to assemble enough money to hire a really good legal team, and even perhaps to bribe the court officials to get them off, right? Caesar pursued a similar, route to try to gain notoriety in the same period, and was successful too. But Cicero gained this reputation for being a brilliant orator. He was a rather long-winded and flowery orator, full of self-congratulation, but somehow, and he really doesn't work for a modern audience, but somehow this works for, this worked for the people of Rome in this period. Cicero does this, and with the end of the Sullan system, he's able to rise to new heights. We're going to see he moves from one position to another until he's eventually elected consul, and that's a feather in his cap. He is a novus homo, but he has opposition during that time as consul, and we'll talk a little bit about those details. Shifting away from Rome for a minute here, because this, I'm not going to go into every detail, of course, with what's happening all over the Mediterranean, but there was a Roman commander named Lucullus, who was appointed as governor, I believe, in Bithynia, or in Asia, perhaps, which gave him. Now, one of the things that Roman elites were jockeying for at this point was, when after they had served a term as consul or praetor, they would try to gain position with proconsular or propraetorian authority, with imperium, in other words, in a frontier province, which would give them the opportunity to raise a client army and go and conquer more territory, which would increase their stature. And this was the route that Marius had followed. This is the route that Sulla followed, and so that's the precedent here. Well, Lucullus had great success in campaigning against Mithridates. You may remember this guy. He was the one who had after Pergamum, after Attalus III of Pergamum had died and bequeathed his kingdom to Rome, he tried to emerge as the great champion of the Hellenistic world, and Sulla had gone off to fight a war against him and had to make a peace because he knew he had to return to Rome. Well, Mithridates was still active in the east. Lucullus went there. He defeated Mithridates in battle, and looked like he was going to take the kingdom of Pontus. But in the meantime, in order to cater to the people of that region, to win their favor, he decreed that their debts would be reduced, and even lowered interest rates that they had to pay and things like this. If we were in the classroom, I would then ask you, who does this anger? Well, I've got the answer here on the slide. The Equitas were the ones primarily tasked with tax collection, and this was not good for them. This meant that they could not profit off of this, because he had reduced those debts and cut the interest rates and things like this. And so Lucullus lost the favor of the Equites, who began to campaign within Rome to have him replaced as commander in the east. He went on to fight against the king of Armenia, whose name was Tigranes, and won a couple of victories over him and was extremely successful there, when he then got word that with the support of the Equites, and with some favorable officials, some acting as tribune, that they had withdrawn his command and given it to Pompey. And so Pompey was coming to replace him in the east. And Lucullus was incensed by this, and he eventually went insane, actually, but not before he made every effort he could to destroy the career of Pompey. This, took away Lucullus's ability to emerge as the next most reputable and important figure in Rome. Well, he'll play a brief role later on. Okay. Now, I'm going to try to rush through this because this is a lot of information, I know. In the meantime, as Lucullus is off fighting, and so here's a map that shows kind of this theater of war for Rome. Pontus is here. That's the kingdom of Mithridates. There's a kingdom of Armenia over here in the Caucasus region between the Black and Caspian Seas. Bithynia at this point was incorporated into Roman territory. The king of Bithynia, whose name was Nicomedes, had also died and bequeathed his country to Rome. This is now Asia, what used to be Pergamum. And so, Rome is gradually eating territory up, mostly by way of diplomacy. But then Lucullus and eventually Pompey is going to come over here and conquer lots and lots of territory. In the year 67, Pompey was given a command, and Edward Watts emphasizes this as a really important moment for him. He's given a command to quell the piracy that was common in especially the Eastern Mediterranean. But this is a very open-ended thing. It gave him a ton of power. It meant that he had access to any port that he needed, that his territorial the territory in which he could operate was not limited. No Roman had ever been given such an open-ended command as this one, and it was supposed to extend for a 3-year term with the possibility of renewal if he needed more time, right? And so he took a massive fleet, and within 3 months, Pompey had effectively nullified the threat of piracy. This was a smashing success that he had. He was given an unprecedented number of soldiers and resources and ships and even officials who accompanied him on this, right? And so Pompey was rising to heights that were just completely unprecedented. And while he was pursuing this command, he then was given the command of Lucullus in the east. And so after those 3 months were up, he didn't lay down his command. Rather, he assumed command in the east, which remained open-ended. This gave him not only power to act as a kind of governor in Asia and Bithynia, but also to pursue wars without the approval of the Senate. He went off and campaigned against Mithridates and defeated him in battle. He did all these things, by the way, with the support of people like Caesar and Cicero, who spoke. Cicero was almost a client of Pompey, not quite. I mean, there were times when Cicero opposed him, but Cicero was one of his main supporters in the Senate. Caesar was supporting him as well, though not probably for different reasons. Caesar was just a really astute judge of the way political winds were blowing, and he saw that people were liking Pompey at this point, and he thought he would do what was popular. Cicero may have been doing that to some extent as well, but anyway, with their support, he gained this command. He defeated Mithridates. Mithridates ended up committing suicide in the Crimea, meaning all the way up here in the northern part of the Black Sea. That's the tip of the Crimea there. And now Rome turned Pontus into a client kingdom. In fact, they had turned Mithridates' son against him, and then they offered him the position as the new client king of Rome. So Pontus is incorporated now as a protectorate. He moved on. He defeated Tigranes in Armenia, and Armenia became a protectorate. Then he moved south and occupied Antioch and effectively dealt a death blow. Not that there was much life left in it anyway, but a death blow to the former Seleucid kingdom, which was significantly reduced. And then he went on to intervene in a civil war going on in Judea, in Palestine. The Hasmonean dynasty there, which was totally dysfunctional. I don't have time to go into that, but it's a really intriguing and often disgusting topic to delve into. The Hasmoneans were really a terrible family. He essentially made Judea a client state as well, turned it into a protectorate. He installed not a king there, but rather the high priest, John Hyrcanus, ended up becoming the effective ruler of Judea. And then even further south, via diplomacy, he turned Petra, which is all the way down here in the Arabian Desert, modern-day Jordan. That now became a client kingdom. It's a kingdom of the native people of that region known as the Nabateans. But it's now one of these Roman protectorates. And all of this was to buffer Rome against the expansion of the Parthian kingdom, which had conquered most of the territory that the Seleucids had once held and were ruling from Persia and Mesopotamia. And they were also, it was becoming obvious they were going to be a great rival to Rome over here in the east. In doing all of this, Pompey extracted a fantastic amount of wealth. You can see he minted his own coins here. This says Magnus Proconsul, which is what he was. He had proconsular authority with Imperium, and you can see, the face of Pompey with a helmet on. He had a beard, apparently. So he managed to compile a fortune that easily rivaled Crassus's, may have been even greater than that of Crassus, almost entirely through war booty. When he returned to Rome in 62, this is the beginning of a sequence of events that were going to change a lot of things. I don't want to get into too many details here. There is a great description of this in the Watts book. There's less in the Thomas Africa textbook, I believe. Watts gives a long description of this, but Pompey made the mistake of disbanding his army before he entered the city of Rome. He was trying to follow tradition in this respect, and he found that a contingent of senators led by Cato, but involving also Lucullus, were standing in his way of achieving certain goals that he wanted. All right. Although they did eventually give him a triumph, there was some question of whether that would happen, and they haggled over the terms of the triumph. They tried to limit the grandeur of it and everything. But that did eventually happen. Okay, in fact, it happened on a scale that was unheard of up to this point. But more importantly, they refused to ratify what he had done in the East. All of these protectorates that he had created, they brought in Lucullus, who hated Pompey and wanted to ruin him, for instance. They got him to quibble with everything that Pompey had done because he was the Eastern expert, having spent several years there. Of course, the main qualification was that he despised him. This contingent of senators was led by Cato the Younger. And Cato seems to have seen Pompey as the greatest threat to Rome. He felt that he was going to be another Sulla, and that he was jockeying for a position that that would make him effectively dictator or even king. And so he was marginalized. They refused to ratify what he had done. They refused to give lands and pensions to his soldiers. And this is what forced Pompey into the arms of Crassus and Caesar, which became the first triumvirate. And that's what I'm going to go into in the next lecture. So I think that this